India correspondent Akshay Dongre now joins us live with more. Akshay, unprecedented developments in Venezuela. Donald Trump says Nicolas Maduro
that has been taken up is being condemned by several countries, not only in the region but with kind of concerns being expressed from around the world.
Akshay, it will be useful for our viewers as to what led to this dramatic escalation by the United States against Venezuela.
Well, it has been in the making since 1998 when Hugo Chavez became the president. He, some years later into his presidency, declared himself a socialist, anti-imperialist, and questioned the policies of the US government. Then he remained in power, and after his death, when Nicolas Maduro came, he continued with that policy. In fact, even in 2019, breaking all ties with the United States, also expelling many of the diplomats that were there in Caracas. In retaliation, US had expelled Venezuelan diplomats, and the tensions escalated. And since 2019, the United States government does not recognize Nicolas Maduro as the head of state. Instead, going and moving towards the National Assembly that is there, and their leader that has led to a lot of tensions. In fact, the breaking up of ties was also because of the United States declaring the National Assembly president as the leader of the country instead of Nicolas Maduro. That had led to this rift. So the tensions had more or less escalated or remained on a boil for the last 2 decades. In fact, more than that. But the situations escalated after the second term of Donald Trump that called the regime of Nicolas Maduro a narco-terror group accused Nicolas Maduro of himself running a huge cartel and exporting drugs to Venezuela. Then we saw there were reports coming in that several of the boats that were there in the waters near the United States were blown up with Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth accusing them of being of terrorists. And in fact, since then the tensions have been there at quite an alarming height. But now what we are seeing is unprecedented. The leader of a country, of an independent country, flown out like this is in fact quite concerning for the entire region.
Right. Akshay, little is known about the actual sequence of events, although we have those visuals of explosions rocking Caracas early this morning. But the question now is, what happens next? I mean, who is in command if Maduro is gone, as Donald Trump says he is?
Well, it's quite speculative at this point in time that what's going to happen. But if anything that we have learned from the United States tensions with Cuba is that people are not going to take this sort of move lightly. Nicolas Maduro, though he was called an authoritarian leader, a dictator by the United States, he had his own following in his own country. People still saw him as many of the people, if not all, saw him as their leader. And also, the big elephant in the room remains that Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the entire world, even more than Saudi Arabia. There were experts that were pointing out that if in any way there is a regime change in Venezuela, more favorable government comes to Venezuela and does a trade with the US as far as oil is concerned, then the sort of dependence that US has on Middle East for at least their oil reserves goes down by quite a margin. That will give US its own sort of independence to act in the region. But what we are seeing right now is quite distressing for the world that has seen several of these kind of conflicts erupting in the last 1 decade, including the Ukraine-Russia crisis. Then we have a crisis already taking place in the Middle East and other regions as well, in Africa. But now the world's biggest military power getting involved.
President Donald Trump's social media post. But the international reactions coming in now. Russia has condemned US military actions in Venezuela. Akshay, your comments on that. International reactions are now pouring in. Cuba, earlier we know Colombian president was the first to raise alarm, and now Russia has condemned US action. Are there measures that the international community could take against this action besides condemnation?
Well, it seems that that's going to be it as far as the action, the sort of condemnations are concerned, because there is highly unlikely that any country is going to get involved in this very murky, decades-old rather, rivalry that has been going on there in the region. But very interesting to note that today there was a large delegation. In fact, yesterday, now according to Venezuelan time, a large Chinese delegation that was in the country that was headed by the Chinese special envoy to the Latin American countries. They had signed multiple memorandums of understanding and were coming to, in fact, even in hundreds agreements. Both the countries, Venezuela and China, were going to sign several deals on trade, on the economy, on sort of possibly crude oil and other kind of resources that Venezuela has, and the sort of money that China could have provided.
Akshay, would just interrupt you for a moment.
Just
interrupt you for a moment. There are more updates coming in now. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is said to be closely monitoring the situation in Venezuela, the dramatic action by US forces in Venezuela. Russia has condemned the US military strikes against Venezuela. As per US President Donald Trump, Nicolas Maduro and his wife have been captured and taken out of Venezuela. And here the update that's just coming in. Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is closely monitoring the situation. Akshay, the update coming in from Italy makes me wonder if American NATO allies were on board in this major action that Donald Trump administration has taken against Venezuela. The update coming in that Italian Prime Minister is closely observing the situation. More reactions yet to come from the others.
Well, Germans have also reacted, stating that they are concerned about this action that has been taken. They have expressed their own concern about this action that has been taken by the United States. So, and on the question of whether NATO was on board, then it is unlikely that NATO would have been, unless United States would have informed very close allies like the UK or probably France about this kind of action that they were planning to take. Even not France, because there have been tensions between Trump and Macron for some time. So it is quite possible that in the entire NATO grouping was excluded from this action that was taken, because this is happening right in the backyard of the United States. It doesn't require any kind of help from the NATO allies when it comes to action in the region. It is quite equipped. It is the largest military, not only in the region but the entire world, operating huge fleets of aircraft carriers, that too nuclear powered in the region, submarines and everything else. So there is a very high probability that the NATO was not taken on board, especially because Donald Trump has been trying to undermine the sort of authority that NATO tries to have when it comes to the world matters. But it's quite plausible that the NATO countries, especially the European allies, are going to question this decision, because that undermines their support to Ukraine, where they accuse Russia of acting against an independent country, against a sovereign country, because their own ally has done the same. So now there can be a whataboutery about this entire thing, and Russia can escalate the strikes in Ukraine, stating that if US can take action, then how come Europe has a double standard in these two cases? So obviously there is going to be some sort of probably condemnation or concerns that will be expressed, but there is highly unlikely that anything NATO can do about this entire situation.
Right, and Akshay, we might have a little more insight into whether NATO was on board as far as this operation is concerned. We earlier mentioned that Italian leader was closely monitoring the situation. Spain now calls for de-escalation, and it has asked for respect of international law, really hinting at that perhaps the US action in question may not have followed the tenets of international law there.
Well, there you have it, the calls for de-escalation coming in from European countries and NATO allies, because now it will be a difficult task for the NATO countries to justify their support to Ukraine, and justify to their own populations also, to state that, the kind of action that Russia has been taken is illegal, and there will be question for a kind of a double, probably a hypocrisy while talking about these two conflicts.
Akshay, thank you for joining us with those updates.